Welcome to week 4. So, this week we will be focusing largely on the auditory style of learning in addition to performing our received pronunciation and mastering Cockney. So, we've got some big priorities this week. Uh, so, for your lecture this week, I know in your syllabus it says that we're going to have a reading packet on auditory learning styles. But as I've gotten to know you as a class, I think instead what we're going to focus on is looking at some of the societal implications of RP, Cockney, and other dialects. So that's where we're focusing on our reading this week. This week, for your lecture here, we're focusing on auditory learners. And I'm just basically giving you a few ideas. I hope that as this semester progresses, you are coming up with more and more ideas of exercises and things that you could possibly put together to create really cool lesson plans. This week, I've got a couple of ideas for you, but please know that there are many, many, many more. And in fact, on the discussion board, you'll be talking about some of your thoughts on some possible lesson plans that you could put together for auditory learners with auditory learners in mind. Now, as always, we want to make sure that we're engaging all different kinds of learners all the time, but I want to kind of focus in this week on auditory learners. So, uh, a couple of commonalities. Again, last week we explored the commonalities that are found between visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners, all of that. So just to review a couple of the big ticket items here. In general, our auditory learners are also the ones that are adding noise to our classroom. At least that has been my experience. They're verbal processors, and so it's often can be hard to get everybody to be quiet when you have a lot of auditory learners. Now, that doesn't mean that every auditory learner does speak out, but obviously many of them are, as they're trying to learn, may have more questions. Generally, auditory learners prefer spoken directions to written directions. And one thing that I think is a good indicator, I have certainly observed this, is they read or watch other speakers while moving lips or whispering the words along. So if they're reading in class, you might see them whispering the words. But I also find that with kinesthetic learners as well. But this is just an idea. Explain and discuss are good cue words and ones that I find that are entirely necessary when I'm working with these students, especially with accent and dialect work. We need to, we'll find that some of the exercises involve finding snippets of sound that illustrate a sound change. In this case, it's really important that they're able to describe to me why. Why is this an important or excellent piece of material from the field, right? Make sure that that is always at the forefront of our conversations. So, acquisition exercises. Here are some ideas of things that you could put together. So I've put together a couple of YouTube links for you in this lecture. Feel free to go ahead and go to those links as we get to them. This is the most common way that we engage auditory learners in accent and dialect class, and it's through active listening in class. When I was going to school, this was all we did really. We would listen to an accent or dialect coach speaking in front of the class, whether it was the teacher or, as we started using outside multimedia, this is still a valid option. So Robert Blumenfeld is another dialectician, and I would say his text is really quite good. If you're looking for another option, maybe the Paul Meyer book doesn't quite do it for you, I check into Robert Blumenfeld. You can actually hear some of his recordings of accents online. There are a few videos that have been made, and we have an example here. This really is listening to the accent over and over and over and over, and usually by a dialect coach. I've got an example here. This is a Russian example. As you're listening, I'd like you to take notes and see what you think the challenges would be and what the benefits would be to listening to this in your classroom with your students. Say you had to have a Russian actor, or maybe you decided to utilize a Russian accent for a lot of moments in a specific piece. You could listen to this YouTube video. So take a second, listen to the video, and come back. So, also, some things to keep in mind with listening to these types of recordings. You'll notice that that recording didn't give the student time necessarily to respond and to put it into their own body. So, that's an interesting thing. One thing that I think is good about that, like that video, for instance, is that it has some of the original language at the beginning. And that, I think, can be very, very helpful for auditory learners. I know for myself, I get a lot of sense of the accent by listening to the language from which it comes, the original language. So auditory learners definitely can do well with this. So maybe you could put together a scavenger hunt of, find a snippet of this language and then apply it to your text. That might be a good thing to do. Challenges with this kind of exercise in class is if your students are auditory learners, if they've got great ears, nothing is quicker. It's definitely very, very, very quick. My challenge with it in the classroom is that while it's quick, the results are very broad, meaning that we can head towards cliche land very, very quickly. And I find that often the students that are auditory learners many times think that they have completely mastered the accent or dialect and are not able to pick up on the small nuances that visual and kinesthetic learners who are learning using different methodologies might find. So that's why, again, we always want to combine all different types of learning styles to be able to be well-rounded, but those are things we want to watch out for. So again, active listening in class, basically playing a podcast or examples of the speech. This is the typical way that most people have learned accents for ages now. But I think we've got a couple other new things we can look at here. So one of my favorite ones, I pretty much always have this in all of my classes, is a native speaker YouTube scavenger hunt. When we are looking for pieces for them to bring in, and this is great. I know on the discussion board this last week, I saw a lot of people talking about having to utilize technology in the classroom, like iPads and things like that. This is a really cool opportunity. Obviously, you always have to be careful because YouTube can be a crazy, scary place. But it does have a lot of examples of the way people speak. Things that I always tell people to keep in mind when I am talking to my students about this. News anchors and interviews are always really, really good options. The reason behind that is because there's usually heightened emotion in a interview situation. Now, the news anchor themselves, we talk about, the fact that the news anchors themselves may be very polished, and so they may not have the best, most local sound if we're looking for a specific sound, but that the interviewees, the locals, are really going to have, this might be the biggest thing that's ever happened to them, and so they're not going to self-edit like we might get on that idea archive that Paul Myers put together with The Common Gets a Cure. A lot of those, if you guys have been listening to those, I'm sure you've heard the self-editing that happens and the way that people change the way they speak from when they're reading Kame Gets a Cure to when they're asked to maybe share a memory from their childhood or something like that. So we're looking for heightened emotions. So I usually end up with a lot of tragedy and a lot of comedy. So usually heavier on the comedy. And you could even tell students to go find funny clips. The thing that's important is just to make sure we can always get out of cliche land if we start to head there. So I've put up a couple of ideas that people have brought into my classes before. Every year I get different things from students, but these are just some of my favorite ones. Again, the emphasis should be on this is a real life speaker, not something that is set up for comedy. The Welsh example may not be the best example of that because it is, I think it was perhaps set up for comedy, but it's still a good example to bring in because it helps the students hear all of those sounds in a heightened emotion setting. So I'll give you a moment to listen to the Welsh, the Australian, and the Irish links below, but then come back and we'll chat about them. So hopefully you have listened to those, and I hope you got a couple giggles out of that. But that is really the majority of what we do we usually have at least one day where it's a scavenger hunt and everybody brings in different pieces and we listen to them. Now, it's important that when we listen to them, you as a teacher will have to be adept enough to be able to bring people back to the task at hand and bringing it back into the world of scholarly observation instead of just YouTube rabbit hole giggling glory. I always suggest focusing on specific sounds. So just as with the IPA last week and the week before especially, we worked with the idea of broad transcription versus narrow transcription. My suggestion is to always have, when I send this home to a student, I say find 3 snippets or 3 words that they're saying that you can pick out the sound and you know exactly what it is and can reproduce it for us. That is going to help them stay on track. Also encourage modeling for the class. So it's not enough for them to just find a funny YouTube video. They have to find a funny YouTube video if they're going to find a funny one and bring it in and bring it to life for us and show us why is this a good academic resource. And again, I do recommend finding serious and comedic pieces when possible. We have a conversation about, why, as we've already discussed earlier prior to you guys watching these videos, why you look for pieces with heightened emotion and why that can be helpful in discovering the true root of an accent or a dialect. So that's the native speaker YouTube scavenger hunt, always super, super popular. Feel free to think about how you could maybe put a twist on that and come up with something different. But this works for middle school, high school, and beyond. So one of the other exercises here is music mirroring. I've done this for my students who are specifically auditory learners because this gives them an opportunity. Generally, they really do love music and hear music in a different way. And so I challenge students to bring in a piece of instrumental music that reminds them of the music of the language, the original language. Okay, so not the accent necessarily, but the original language. So I also would recommend that we focus on instrumental music, not anything with any vocals. And this exercise always amazes me. Every time I give this assignment back, I get such interesting and varying pieces, and it's really interesting to hear what everybody else hears, and it's always a really good day. So we usually start with identifying adjectives that describe the inflection and intonation of an accent or of the original language. So, for instance, I might play Gaelic, a couple of passages in Gaelic, and we listen to the rise and fall, and we try to put words to maybe some musical words to what we think of when we hear the Gaelic language. And then we might actually listen to some of the some Irish accents of English and listen, how did some of those accents, how did some of those adjectives change and go away, or did they stay pretty consistent? And then the students are responsible for going home and finding some pieces of music that remind them of the accent. This is really helpful when you have a student who has trouble with the music and intonation of the accent. Usually in this case, those aren't the auditory learners. The auditory learners usually pick up on this. But for somebody who's having trouble with that, finding that intonation and music of the accent, this is a really good exercise to have them do. I usually start with folk tunes that are indigent to the accent being studied, but then I allow the students to branch out into other cultural music. Every year I have somebody bring in a rap song, and usually they're bringing it in to highlight a sound in the Irish accent, which I think is very interesting. It's usually that unit when I have people bring it in. I think it's the abruptness and kind of and maybe the tapped and flapped R's make people think about, some really rhythmic rap or hip hop beats. I'm not really sure, but every year it happens. It's really interesting. So the challenge of this, obviously, this is just a starting point. If you have a lot of time, this is a good example of something that you can do with the students, because we obviously aren't addressing sound changes at all with this kind of an accent. We are just working with inflection and tone. So keep that in mind. This is one of my favorite acquisition exercises, music mirroring. So just a couple of more ideas for you to take a look at. Obviously, we've got the Paul Myers CDs here. Again, I think that Paul does a really good job of combining in a really balanced way exercises that work, especially for visual and auditory learners, maybe a little bit light on the kinesthetic learners, but he really does, I think, detail things out really well. So obviously that's always a good place to start. There's also in-class teacher modeling and repetition. Again, this is the very most common foundational way to teach accents and dialect work, but the importance is you have to make sure that you have the dialect down. And, we all have our strengths and weaknesses when it comes to which accents come easily to us. And so I would not be afraid to, if you hear that you've got a student in the class who has a really strong, maybe a Russian accent or something like that, have them do the modeling and the repetition for the class. It can be really effective and empowering for the student as well. Also, I usually do a radio theater lesson at some point in the year, and sometimes I try to put that in prior to the prior to the accent unit, just because it gives us a vocabulary to talk about, and we have voices already in our categorized in our memory that I can say, oh, remember this sound, this actor from the radio theater drama. So one of my favorites that I use, especially when I'm doing RP and the other British dialects, keeping in mind societal implications, we listen to Focus on the Family's Radio Theater's version of Chronicles of Narnia. It is an excellent, excellent, excellent piece. I have been listening to it for years and years and years and years and years. A couple of years ago, they had it at Barnes and Noble they had the entire collection, Magician's Nephew all the way to The Last Battle for $10 for like a stocking stuffer. It was crazy. I bought 8 of them and have since given them all away to students usually, but it's really a great example of radio theater, and I always enjoy bringing that into our theater classrooms as we're able, because I think the art form itself is, well, perhaps not thriving at the moment, I do think it has a lot of educational benefits. So I would definitely recommend bringing in some kind of radio theater piece at some point to help start getting people used to this idea of listening, and the idea that that auditorily our vision can be captured and we can imagine worlds that we are not seeing in front of us. My last and most popular exercise is always making their own YouTube tutorials or podcasts. So many of my students really enjoy this. We usually assign this in groups, but you can do it one-on-one as well, and it works really well. They love this generation is so excellent at utilizing technology and editing, and really, this is often my final project that I give to my high school students. Is building a YouTube video tutorial of a specific accent or dialect, and it works really, really well. And especially my auditory learners really thrive in this kind of atmosphere. So those are the basic art acquisition exercises I wanted to talk with you about this week. Again, these are just the ones I use. I'm sure there are many more, and we'll be discussing more of them on the discussion board as well. I'd like to hear all of your thoughts about some other audio exercises that you could put together specifically to access those learners that are auditorily focused. I also appreciate you listening through this lecture this week. It's a little bit shorter than usual. I'm really struggling with a cold and not feeling well, so I apologize that my voice is not its usual emphatic self. So thank you so much. If you have questions, let me know through email. You should be getting quite a few pieces of material back this week so that you can see, but thus far, I'm very pleased with everything I've seen from everyone in this class. I would just encourage you to go on this week and to continue to just keep your head down. You've got this. I'm very proud of all of you. Thank you so much. Have a great week. Bye-bye.